topic of the video for today is Locke on personal identity. The basic topic is the question, what makes for the unity of a person? What is it to be the same person existing at different times, different places? What connects all of the different appearances you make at different times and places? We saw already back in book 1 when Locke was arguing against Descartes' conception of thinking substance. He raised this question about what is the identity of a person. But then, prompted by a friend of his, he added a new chapter to the second edition from 1694, chapter 27 in book 2, devoted to this topic of identity and diversity, and in particular with a focus on the question of personal identity. Now, to think about how this question could arise, am I the same as myself at a different time or place? Locke himself starts with other examples of identity other than personal identity. So I want to start with one to give us a sense of what this question about identity is. So here we see Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin puts the piece of bread in the toaster. In the first panel, waits. In the second panel, toast pops up. Hobbes asks, where does the bread go? Calvin, beats me, isn't that weird? So the problem, and in this case it's a joke because it's not really a problem, but the basic issue is something changed. Time moved on. Is the toast the same thing as the bread, or did one thing disappear and a toast appear? And so the question then, is there an identity between those two things? That's one way to think about what the issue is at stake when we're asking about, is there an identity of a person? Okay. So it's important to remember when thinking about this question, personal identity, that Locke considers identity to be a relation, and we can symbolize this relation with the equal sign. And of course, whenever we use the equal sign, we're asking the question, are the two things that stand on the two sides of the equal sign the same? If we're asking about identity and using the equal sign to symbolize that. So one kind of identity you could talk about, equating two things, is a qualitative identity. So we can have two cars that are the same. They're made in the same factory, same color, everything's the same about them. That's one kind of identity. They're indiscernible. The two appear to be identical because they're identical in all the qualitative features. Nevertheless, as you can see in the picture here, when you have two qualitatively identical things, you have two things. You can count them, 1 and 2. This is not the sense of identity that's at issue when it comes to personal identity. Instead, what's at issue is a numerical identity. Not just is something qualitatively the same, but is something numerically the same, which is to say, when you're counting, do you count 2, as in the picture of the two cars here, or is there only one thing to count? Only if you are counting 1 do you have a numerical identity. And so a numerical identity is also a self-identity. When the equal sign is used in the sense of a numerical identity, you're talking about one thing and you're saying the thing is the same as itself. Now this seems pretty odd at first. Self-identity, why would you ever even need to talk about self-identity? It seems almost paradoxical even to raise the issue of something being the same as itself. The reason why this question arises is because one single thing can appear or be known in different ways. Samuel Clemens, the person, and Mark Twain are one single human being. But each of them can appear in different ways. Someone who knew Samuel Clemens growing up may have not known that he was the author of Huckleberry Finn and so forth. So in that way, even though there's only one person here, there are two ways you could know that person, and because of that, a meaningful question can arise. Is Samuel Clemens equal to Mark Twain? Yes, it is, and so you have a self-identity. A famous example from the German philosopher Frege is the identity of the evening star and the morning star. The bright star that you first see in the evening and the bright star that you see in the morning right before the sun rises, they are numerically one. It's Venus, the planet Venus. But as Frege said, the evening star and a morning star, those terms stand for different senses or modes of presentation. So it's a meaningful question to ask, is the evening star the same as the morning star? And then with the Calvin and Hobbes, we had the same question more simply demonstrated, is the bread the same as the toast? The question is meaningful because each of those has a different way that they're known. And so what we want to ask when we're asking the question about identity is, are they the same? So, in other words, the identity is a relation, and a relation is always a relation between two places. But in this case, what stands in the relation are not two things that you can count, but rather two aspects of a thing, or two appearances of a thing, or two ways a thing can be known. And so for all of these examples here, you could know one and not know the other, or you could learn that they're the same thing, or it might turn out that they're not the same thing given certain circumstances. And so the question of personal identity asks, in general, does A equal B? Where equal means being numerically identical. If they're not numerically identical, then A does not equal B, and that's what Locke calls diversity. Are there, in fact, two things, or is there one thing? So Locke starts his chapter on identity and diversity with a general account of how we get ideas of identity and diversity. We form these ideas of identity and diversity, he says, when considering anything as existing at any determined time and place, we compare it with itself existing at another time. So here we have this seemingly paradoxical concept of a self-comparison, and the self-comparison is either leading to a claim about self-identity, or it's not a self-comparison, and then it turns out you have two things. You compare the bread with the toast. Are they the same, identical, or are they different? Are they numerically different? Is there just one thing there, or are there two things? That's the sense that you're comparing something with itself. It's important to remember before we get into the details here that these concepts of identity and diversity, which is something can be symbolized by the equal sign or the not equal sign, identity and diversity are relations, not properties. Identity isn't something that we have that could be lost or stolen. So this is the way we talk about identity sometimes, even personal identity, right? We say sometimes that we have an identity. We say that someone stole your identity. But this is different from, even if related to, the idea of personal identity that Locke is talking about. So you have an identification card so that somebody can re-identify you and say, this person who's trying to buy this car is the same person who owns the bank account that has the money, and so forth. So the identification is a kind of proof of the identity of who's trying to purchase the car here and the person who has the bank account to do so. And so all the features of your life that make it possible to re-identify you in different times and places comes to be thought of as your identity. Now, that is somewhat of a loose manner of speaking when you consider this idea of identity as a relation. It's not an incorrect way of speaking. That's just how our language has evolved to use this concept of identity. But it is really important to keep that distinct from what Locke is talking about, because if we import into Locke this more everyday talk about I have an identity and my identity is something that I gain or lose, then or change, then you're getting away from Locke's question. Even if there is an underlying relationship there, but you're getting away from the core of Locke's question, which is something, a person, say, the same person in different times and places? And so the question arises for identity: what are the criteria of identity? How do we know that an appearance at one time and an appearance at another is one and the same thing? How do we determine whether the toast is the same as the bread, whether Samuel Clemens is the same as Mark Twain, and so forth? Now, although the question of personal identity is obviously the central question that Locke wants to address in this chapter, he kind of works up to that account by talking about identity more generally, and by talking about how the criteria of identity are going to differ greatly depending on what kind of thing you're talking about. Locke just says about atoms that they are the same as themselves as long as they continue to exist. But we can also talk about inorganic objects, a rock or something like that, and he calls this a mass of matter. What would it be for some mass of matter to be the same as itself in different times and places, to be numerically one? Here Locke says, well, as long as it has the same collection of atoms that it had to begin with, then it's the same mass of matter. If it loses an atom or gains an atom, then it's a different mass of matter. The more interesting cases are plants, animals, human beings, as he goes on to discuss in the next few sections. In all of these cases, the thing, the plant or the animal, can gain or lose atoms and yet still remain the same plant or animal. And this means that we need a different account of identity for a plant than a mass of matter, and a different account of identity for a human being than a plant. Since the plant can gain or lose cells or atoms and still remain the same plant, the plant is not the same thing as some mass of matter. If it were a mass of matter, it would cease to exist whenever it lost an atom. So why are these criteria different from type of thing to type of thing? A plant or animal is not the same thing as the mass of matter of which it is composed. The plant continues to exist even when the mass of matter that it used to be changes. If the plant is not equivalent to a mass of matter, you might easily suppose that the plant must therefore have something extra, another thing added to it that makes it a plant. But as we'll see, Locke's answer is no. That is not how a plant is distinguished from a mass of matter, or how a human being is distinct from a plant, or, as we'll see later, how a person is distinct from a human being. So Locke spends a bit of time talking about plant identity, and I think It's not because he's so interested in plants per se, but rather because the way he distinguishes plant identity from the identity of a mass of matter is going to be helpful in order to understand personal identity. So the idea here with plant identity, to use Locke's example, we can take an oak tree. It grows from a seedling to a large old tree. We all say that the old tree is the same tree as the seedling. That is, there's only one tree there. They are numerically identical. In other words, here's this idea of talking about identity as a relation between two things. Well, are they two things? There's the young tree, the old tree. So those are the two kind of appearances of the tree, the young and the old tree. The question arises, are they the same? Are they numerically the same? And Locke says, we all say yes, of course it's the same. But what stays the same? Why do we say it's the same tree? What is it that stays the same? Locke makes clear it's not the mass of matter. After all, the tree loses all its leaves in the fall. It grows. It sheds atoms all the time. It's gaining atoms through its nutrition and so forth. So it's not the mass of matter, the collection of particles, that makes the tree the same tree. That mass of matter changes, goes out of existence every second. What is continuous throughout this change of mass of matter is the organization of the parts of the tree, or that the tree participates in one life over this time. In this process of gaining and losing material, the process of nutrition and growth and so forth, there's one continuous life. Now, someone in the Aristotelian tradition might say, well, what this means is that the plant has some kind of immaterial form or soul. That's something in addition to the matter that gives form to the matter. But in this respect, Locke is like the moderns, like Descartes. He's not willing to say that the plant has some kind of soul that directs all the matter to function in a certain way. In other words, in Locke's account, there's nothing more there than a mass of matter at any particular time. Nevertheless, we can talk about the plant as something that's not equivalent to any mass of matter. The plant is this continued life that takes on and loses matter over time. It's what the plant does that makes it something more than the mass of matter. It's not that there's this extra thing like a vegetative soul, as in the Aristotelian tradition. And for Locke, there's nothing mysterious about this. This is just how we learn about the world, give names to things, talk about trees. The very name of a tree refers to this thing that has this kind of life that we can re-identify over time, that doesn't go out of existence just because it loses a leaf. Now, of course, we could consider that thing over there that we're looking at that's green and has a trunk and so forth. We could consider it just as a mass of matter, and we could say that when a leaf falls off, it's not the same, it's not numerically the same anymore. We could say that, but that's just not a convenient way of talking. And this is just to indicate that when we talk about the tree as something more than the mass of matter, when we talk about the tree as something that continues to exist throughout all these changes, we're not committing ourselves to there being any sort of extra stuff there, an extra vegetative soul. Instead, we're considering that thing in the world, the tree, insofar as it has this organization and it plays a certain role in human life as well. The tree grows and has fruit in the fall and so forth, and so it's useful for us to consider this tree as one and the same thing. And maybe I own this tree, and so it becomes important to say that this is one thing. And so this difference between the identity of a mass of matter and the identity of a plant and later an animal brings up this point that identity is going to depend on the kind of thing that you're asking about. Locke therefore says, it is not therefore a unity of substance that comprehends all sorts of identity. So maybe the unity of an atom is the unity of a substance. We must consider what idea the word is applied to stands for, the idea of tree. It being one thing to be the same substance, another the same man, and a third the same person, if person, man, and substance are three names standing for three different ideas. That is to say, we have to first determine what is it that we're talking about. What is it to be a man or a plant or a person? Then we can determine what the criteria are for saying that something is the same man or the same person in different times. And as Locke indicates here, what at first might seem counterintuitive, he wants to distinguish the identity of a person and the identity of a man or a human being. And this is actually important to understand Locke's account of personal identity. So before he talks about personal identity, he talks about human identity. The identity of a human being, or as Locke says, of a man, over time is much like that of a plant or animal. It's not the same as the identity of a soul or spirit, a thinking substance. So remember how he said that it's not unity of substance that comprehends all sorts of identity. That goes for the atoms making up a plant, and it also goes for if there's a thinking substance making up in part a human being. The human being is not the same as a soul or spirit. So Locke denies the view that one is the same human being as long as one has the same soul. And here he uses the example of the possibility of the transmigration of souls or the revolution of souls to make this point. And this is something he comes back to later on when he's talking about personal identity, brings up these possibilities that a soul or a spirit could occupy one body at one time and another body at another time and be reborn thousands of years later and so forth, be reincarnated. And in raising this is not just an idle possibility for Locke. Locke doesn't endorse it, but this idea of a revolution of souls was discussed by authors in his time, especially with those associated with the tradition of Platonism, especially centered around some theologians in Cambridge. And from here we can see this book by Francis Mercury van Helmont from 1685, so it's only a few years before the publication of Locke's essay, and Van Helmont talks about the revolution of human souls, which is this idea that human souls come in and out of bodies, basically reincarnation. And so in this context, Locke raises this possibility to say something like, if a soul of a certain person were reincarnated into the body of an animal, example he uses in the text here, no one would say that an animal with a certain soul that used to belong to a human, therefore, is actually also a human. And again, Locke raises this possibility not because he believes in the transmigration or revolution of souls, but rather because he wants to make the point that the identity of a human being involves participation in the same continued life with the same body. That's the way that the identity of a human being is, it turns out, much like that of a plant. And of course, this doesn't mean that human beings are like plants, but rather that the criteria for re-identifying them as the same over time are similar. And closely connected to that thought that the identity of a human is essentially the continuation of a certain life in a certain body, Locke adds, indirectly criticizing this thought that a human being is in its essence a rational animal. Locke adds these counterexamples. He says a very irrational man, someone who wouldn't even be said to possess reason at all, could still very well be considered a human being. And on the other side, he gives this long example of a parrot who supposedly could have a conversation. Whether or not the parrot really could think and reason in a way similar to a human being could, Locke's point is that even if you did have a parrot that could reason, it would be a parrot, not a human being. What makes the human being a human being is the kind of body he has, and that he continues in that same life over time. And so all of this is ultimately important by way of contrast with his account of personal identity. So in order to know what personal identity is, Locke's already told us we need to know what the idea of the person is. Just like we needed to be able to distinguish the idea of a tree from a mass of matter, we also need to distinguish the idea of a person from the idea of a human being. Locke says, we must consider what the word person stands for, which I think is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself the same thinking thing in different times and places. So we just saw that Locke said that you could lack reason and still be a human being. A person, by contrast, is an intelligent being with reason and reflection. But just as important is the second part of this account of a person here, that the person not only has intelligence, but as he says in this phrase that I highlighted here, he can consider himself as himself. So he considers himself to be the same person in different times and places. And Locke adds, everyone is to himself that which he calls self. It is not considered in this case whether the same self be continued in the same or diverse substances. So this gets back to the theme that identity, not all sorts of identity, need be the same as the identity of a substance. As he highlights in that first quote, what matters is that you can consider yourself to be yourself. Whether that involves continuing as the same substance or not is irrelevant. It's sort of just as irrelevant to whether the plant continues to have the same atoms. And so what we see is that the human being is not the same as a certain soul or spirit. The human being has to have the same continued body. But if we consider the spirit or thinking substance as a substance, then Locke is also saying when we're talking about a person, what does the idea of a person stand for? When I talk about myself as a person, and I use the word self or person, I'm not referring to a substance. That's what Descartes thought. That when I say I think and I identify myself as something thinking, that what I'm talking about when I use the word I'm talking about a substance. Locke says, no, I'm not talking about a substance when I use the word when I talk about myself, consider myself a person. No, I'm talking about whatever it is that is the same continued self that can consider itself as itself in different times and places, whether the continuation of that self is the continuation of the same substance or diverse or more than one substance. So what's unusual about this idea of a person and about personal identity is that personal identity involves awareness of that identity. There's something seemingly paradoxical about that. And in fact, this was the basis of an objection to Locke's theory that Thomas Reid also raises in the extra reading. But the fact that it seems paradoxical doesn't mean it's false. We would have to think through this more. But the idea here is that to be a self, part of what it is to be a self over time is to be able to be aware of all the different times and places that you existed, and indeed to be aware of the fact that you are this unity of a person over time. It's certainly not something that plant identity involves. So one way to put this is that for the person, unlike for plant or human identity, for personal identity, the identity and the awareness of the identity are really the same, or they amount to the same thing. That's what it is to have the identity. Or rather, one is a unified single person just to the extent that one is aware of the unity and all the different parts of who you are as a person. And when I say parts, I mean temporal parts or appearances that you make over time. And so Locke adds back in section 9, and as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. So the identity of a person is the identity of this consciousness, understood in this way as the awareness of the identity. This is the self of our consciousness, and Locke says, person, as I take it, is the name for this self. And so as we're about to see, that means that when I talk about myself, I'm not talking simply about my body, or I'm not talking about the human being that I am either. It's true that a person is a thinking thing with a body. A thinking conscious self has some body. Rejecting a view that puts too much emphasis on the soul or the spirit, or that confuses a person with the spirit, Locke says, when I talk about myself, I am in part talking about the body that I have. My body is part of myself. It's part of my thinking conscious self. And he says that a person sympathizes and is concerned for his body precisely because it's part of himself. Locke says in section 17, every part of your body is part of yourself. And if your little finger is separated from the rest of your body, and if for some reason your consciousness stayed with the little finger and left the rest of your body, then, Locke says, it is evident the little finger would be the person, the same person, and self then would have nothing to do with the rest of the body. So the person requires a body, but not just any body, it's the body in which the consciousness persists. And so this example with the little finger alludes to the further point that although a person has a body always, it needn't be the same body. And this is what is highlighted in this famous example of the prince and the cobbler. In this example, Locke supposes that the consciousness remains with the soul of the prince, and the soul of the prince enters the body of the cobbler. Locke says, when the soul of the prince enters the cobbler's body, that is the same person as the prince. So if the prince committed a crime, then this new being that has the prince's soul with all his thoughts and memories and so forth now in the cobbler's body would be responsible. And the cobbler's, what had been that body of the cobbler is now the prince's body. But what Locke is most keen to have us learn from this thought experiment is that when the prince's soul enters the cobbler's body, no one would say that it's still the same human being. That is, the cobbler with the cobbler's soul changed into the cobbler's body now with a new soul. Locke saying, that's not the same human being anymore. No one would say that, Locke says. But it is the same person as the prince. So in that case, the consciousness of the prince comes to and with the soul of the prince into the cobbler's body. And so the lesson Locke wants to draw from this example is that personal identity is not the same as human identity. And part of what Locke is getting at here is, as he says in the very beginning of that section, section 15, and thus we may be able without any difficulty to conceive the same person at the resurrection, though in a body not exactly in make or parts the same which he had here, the same consciousness going along with the soul that inhabits it. And Locke was certainly interested in this religious question of the bodily resurrection. How would that be? And here Locke is acknowledging you can make sense of this bodily resurrection and say that in the next world, when the dead are raised, they can have a body, but it needn't be the same body. You can be the same person who's subject to rewards and punishments without having the same body. But this is different from the identity of the human being. As Locke concludes the discussion here, he says, the body too goes to making the man. In other words, different body, different human being, but not necessarily different person. Now, this famous prince and cobbler example can be a little deceptive or misleading because of the fact that it's an example of the consciousness of the prince coming with the soul of the prince to the body of the cobbler, making it seem that personal identity and identity of soul are the same. But Locke is very clear in the rest of the chapter that we should not equate personal identity with identity of spirit or soul. So the self that I'm aware of and I consider myself the same at different times, it's going to include a spirit in the same way we just said that it includes a body above, but it does not necessarily always have the same spirit. And here he goes back to this account of the growth of the plant and how it is we say the plant is one and the same plant. Just as atoms come and go in the plant and yet the plant remains, we can equally say that different spirits could come and go in the same person, different thinking substances. And Locke compares this to a man wearing different clothes on different days. In other words, when talking about who you are as a person and the unity of the person, it doesn't matter what substance it is that is doing the thinking at any particular time or at any particular day. What matters is that you are the same self who can consider yourself as yourself, and that doesn't depend on the same thinking substance always being there. They can come and go just like the atoms in the plant. So I take this to be, therefore, a kind of non-metaphysical account of personhood. Again, Descartes had this metaphysical view. He said, what I'm talking about when I use the word I is a certain substance. But Locke has this conception of a person not as a substance, but rather as I like to say, a kind of point of view on the world. To be the person that you are is to occupy this certain point of view. There. I am a point of view, or I am my point of view on the world. I'm not a certain kind of stuff or substance. I'm a certain kind of awareness, and awareness of the continuity of that awareness as well. Locke says, self is that conscious thinking thing, whatever substance made up of, whether spiritual or material, simple or compounded, it matters not, which is capable of happiness or misery, and so is concerned for itself as far as that consciousness extends. And so here we see another important aspect of Locke's view. This point of view on the world that I am is not just a point of view of experience, but rather it's a point of view of action, planning, thinking about the future, and thinking about myself. Part of what I am, part of my point of view here, is that I consider myself as someone who could end up happy or who could end up miserable. And so I plan for the future, and I think about who I am in the future. And I plan to help make myself happy in the future. And one of the points Locke repeatedly makes is, I don't care about a substance. I care about myself. I care about who I am in the future, or what I am is this continued consciousness. Locke says it doesn't matter what metaphysics you have. And Locke says that, talking about someone who maybe disagrees on whether there's a thinking substance, or like Hobbes, whether thought is a product of material substance, Locke talks about this person, regardless of his metaphysics, there is something that is himself that he is concerned for and would have happy. And by the same consciousness continued on for the future, finds himself to be the same self which did such and such action some years since, by which he comes to be happy or miserable now. Right? I plan for the future because I want something, and I continue to exist. And when I get to that point and I achieve that, or I don't achieve it, I look back on the past and I see that I succeeded or failed or whatever it is. But I don't look back and just think that someone performed some actions that led to my happiness and misery now. I look back and see that I did these actions. And to say that I did them is, again, just to say that there's this continued conscious point of view on the world, not that I identify some single substance or even a single animal that has performed these actions and then benefited from them. Now, one of the consequences of this for Locke is that if I were to lose all memories, then, as he says in section 20, I would be a different person. I maybe would be the same human being. I would have this, there would be the same organization of life in the body. I might even have the same immaterial spirit. But if I forgot everything, if there were a complete break of consciousness, then one can continue as the same human being, but Locke says one wouldn't be the same person anymore. This might seem paradoxical, but think about this idea of a person as something that occupies this point of view on the world. If there's a complete break in consciousness with no memories anymore, then Locke would say you're no longer the same self. You're no longer occupying that same point of view on the world. No longer can you look back at prior actions and see how they led to your current happiness or misery. You can't look back on what you understood as a human being did before the break in memory. You can't look back and sort of regret what you did or be happy about your decisions, be proud of what you did. Rather, you might be grateful to what was done that led to your current happiness, and in a way that's no different from how you would think about how any other person might harm or benefit you. What's distinct about the unity of a person is how you consider it to be your own actions that led to your own happiness or misery. And so for Locke, this conception of a person, and therefore personal identity, has a kind of non-metaphysical character. It's not a matter of substance at all. One self can persist through the coming and going of two spirits or many spirits, thinking substances, right? Just like the tree sheds leaves and atoms and gains more, the person can shed and gain thinking substances. There's nothing preventing that. On the other side, one spirit or thinking substance can remain through the coming and going of two persons, as with that example of the break in memory. As Locke says, nothing but consciousness can unite remote existences into the same person. The identity of substance will not do it. When I consider something that I did in the past to lead to my future happiness or my present happiness, it's not because I think that I'm the same substance, but rather because it's the same consciousness. Now, despite all this talk about the possibility of spirits traveling from body to body or consciousness being transferred from one substance to another, Locke says, I agree, the more probable opinion is that this consciousness is annexed or attached to and the affection of one individual immaterial substance. That is the point of Locke raising all of these crazy examples of consciousness being transferred from substance to substance, was not to say that that was something that was likely to be true, but rather to pinpoint and identify what a person is. Namely, a person is just not the same or equivalent to a certain thinking substance or a thinking substance attached to a body, even if it happens to be the case that the underlying substance of a person is always one substance. And so if person is not a metaphysical term or a term identifying a certain kind of substance, what is it? Locke says that person is a forensic term, using that older spelling, right? This is connected to the point I raised before, that we aim at our own future happiness. That's what we care about. And personal identity matters to us because it's the basis for holding each other morally and legally responsible. And there's this interconnection between this idea of responsibility and the idea of person as this point of view, and especially a point of view that has this goal of attaining happiness for myself and understanding myself when I do or don't attain that happiness as having done so through my own past actions. That is the basis, Locke thinks, for assigning responsibility. Someone, say, commits a crime because they're trying to get money for themselves to help their own future happiness. Then you hold that person responsible because after the crime's committed, he benefited from what he did. In other words, from what his prior self, through that continued consciousness, did. And Locke says, if you were to somehow completely forget about your past, say you completely forgot about a time when you committed a crime, then you wouldn't be responsible. And Locke says, in reality, it would be difficult in a court of law, for example, to prove that you really forgot all of this. But setting that point aside, Locke's point is that if you, say, stole a bunch of money because you're planning for your future, then the question is, do you remember the crime or not? if you remember the crime, then you have this unified person point of view. You plan for your future, you benefited from that, you look back on the past and you see yourself as having done this, and Locke says that is someone who's responsible. But say there was this complete psychic break, loss of consciousness, loss of memory, then you would have a case where someone just finds a bunch of money in the bank account and doesn't know how it got there. And Locke's point is that's not someone who we can punish and hold responsible, because that's no more different than sort of being born with money in the bank account. There's no sense that you can take yourself to have done it. For Locke, it's rather literally like another person committed the crime and anonymously, gave you the rewards. Maybe you have to give the money back, but Locke says in that case he wouldn't be responsible. So to sum up, what matters here for Locke then in the account of personal identity is not any kind of metaphysical consideration of the identity of a substance, but rather, as he says, a forensic consideration of when a person can be responsible for a past action. When I plan for the future or look back on the past, I don't care about the metaphysics. I don't care about what substances are involved. I don't care what's going to happen to my mental, the mental substance that's thinking right now. I don't care about the substance. What I care about is what's going to happen to me, where I am that continued point of view. What I care about is, am I going to feel pleasure or pain in the future? Not is pleasure and pain going to be felt by the thinking substance that's thinking in me right now. And so it doesn't matter whether one consciousness exists over many substances or one substance supports many cells over time. All that matters is that there is this continuity of consciousness, and that is the thing that you're holding responsible.